All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'll get everything set up here. Okay, we can go ahead and get started then. This is our next lecture in the Industrial Revolution. This one is titled Underneath the Gold. If you think back to our last lecture, I talked about it being the Gilded Age. And I said the Gilded Age meant that it was painted in gold per se, or metaphorically painted in gold. And in our last lecture, we looked at all of that gold. We looked at Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Henry Ford. We saw all of the new inventions, and we saw the wealth that was being produced and created underneath by capitalism. But today we're going to scratch away at that gold surface. We're going to get down underneath that gold paint, and we're going to see all the dirt underneath that. We're going to see all the negative impacts of capitalism and of industrialization. Now, what I have to do as a teacher is I have to remain as objective as possible. So, in previous lectures, I presented capitalism and I presented it pretty objectively, meaning that I did not place my own opinions in it. Today, I'm going to be presenting communism. I will also remain objective, which means I'm not going to tell you what my opinion is. My job is to teach you the lesson, not tell you how to think. That's your job. You're the one who actually has to do the thinking. Let's go ahead and get to the essential questions. Number one is, why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Britain? We already went over that. We talked about the resource advantage they had with coal and the financial institutions and the freer political society as well. But today we're really going to be looking at the effects, specifically the social and economic effects. We're going to see what happens to the majority of people because of industrialization. Number two is, what was the role of government in industrialization and how did Western governments differ from non-Western governments? We already went over that as well. We looked at the Western governments taking the hands-off laissez-faire approach and non-Western governments taking a more hands-on approach. And we'll be looking at more non-Western governments in our next lecture. And number three, what were the push and pull factors causing massive migration, and what were the responses to this new influx of immigrants? We'll look at those push and pull factors today. We'll look at some of the responses, but we'll really look at that more in Unit 6. Let's go ahead and get started by looking at the world population. So I made a reference to this chart earlier. I said that the world population is going to rapidly increase under the second industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution is off the chart. It's over here. We're talking end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. This second industrial revolution is really going to begin in about the 1880s. I don't want to set a hard date there, but we'll just say around here. As you can see, the world population is going to drastically increase. There's going to be better technology, there's going to be better medicine, there's more access to food, so more people are capable of surviving. Infant mortality rate goes way, way down. Fewer babies are dying, and more of them are living to adulthood because of the advances in the Industrial Revolution. But many of these people are starting to move into the cities. No longer are they going to be on farms, they'll be living in urban areas and working in urban factories. And I want you to keep all of that in mind because that's going to be the root of many of the problems that we're going to see in the lecture today. Let's start with immigration. So in addition to the fact that the world population is increasing, the population, at least within the United States, is also rapidly increasing because of immigration. So what is it that's causing these people to leave their home country, sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and go just not discover, but go be a part of a new country? Well, there are push factors and there are pull factors. Push factors push people out of their home country. The Irish potato famine that I talked about in the Revolutions of 1848 video is one of those reasons. There's not a whole lot of food, and so people need to find a place that has food. The United States has a whole lot of land, a whole lot of food. And the Chinese economy is suffering, and we'll be looking at that in Unit 6. So we're going to get many Chinese immigrants coming to the west coast of the United States, which is going to cause some issues, but we'll discuss that later. And the last one being the revolutions of 1848. There's a lot of warfare and violence that's happening in Europe during this time period, and many people want to escape that. Just as we have refugee issues today, especially in Europe and the Middle East, there were refugee issues all the way back in 1848 as well. And then we have to look at the pull factors. What's pulling people to the United States? Why come to the United States as opposed to somewhere else? Well, there's a lot more job opportunities. Those job opportunities aren't on the farms, they are in the big cities. So many of these immigrants are going to be moving into these big cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, all of these areas. And in fact, these areas like Detroit and New York and Chicago have ethnic neighborhoods. Growing up near Detroit, we had Mexican Town because many Mexican immigrants moved to that particular part of Detroit. We had Greek Town because many Greek immigrants moved to that specific part of Detroit. And all of the other cities are the same way. So you have many of these ethnic neighborhoods that form within these major cities within the United States, and you'll study those in more detail when you get to AP US history next year. Let's go ahead and move on to the working conditions in these factories. So these working conditions are experienced by poor people living in the cities, whether they are immigrants or not immigrants. As you can see, I don't even need to put the words on here. You can just look at how horrendous these working conditions are. I mean, see how young this kid is. He's a chimney sweep. Why is this kid working as a chimney sweep? Because chimneys are really, really tight. Some full grown man like me is not going to go fit into a chimney. So, yeah, you're going to need a 10-year-old kid, some little middle schooler over at like JD Smith to go in there with a broom and start sweeping the chimney. So you can see he's covered in coal and soot and everything like that. These kids are also are coal workers. In order to get coal, you have to go underground. Once again, full grown man, 6'2". I'm not fitting into the tiny coal mines. That's where these little kids come in. So there's going to be examples of child labor. These working conditions are very dirty as well. If you actually have a job, you're probably used to something called OSHA, which creates these standards for the workplace environment, in which there's certain things you can and cannot do in order to ensure that you are safe. So OSHA creates rules and regulations to ensure that people don't get hurt on the job and don't get sick because of their job. Well, OSHA doesn't exist during this time period. There's no rules or regulations on how many hours a day that you can work, or if a 10-year-old is allowed to go work into a coal mine. It really is just a free for all because this is relatively new for most people. And so they don't realize that they need to have laws and rules in place in order to protect people. We also see the living conditions here. So this is a family of immigrants. I believe this is New York City, although I would have to look up the source of this image, but that's not the point. The point is that this is where they live. You can see all the people who live in something that's pretty much the size of a shoebox. What I want you to keep in mind here is that I want you to compare and contrast this to the Breakers. Remember that big mansion with Cornelius Vanderbilt that we saw in our previous lecture? Think about that when you're looking at this. And you can start to see why people are incredibly upset with industrialization and capitalism. How is it that some people like Cornelius Vanderbilt the second can have this huge mansion overlooking the Atlantic Ocean and have that be his second home, while this family of seven immigrants, I believe it's seven here, live in what is essentially a shoebox. And so we see this massive economic divide. We actually still see this in our society today, and many people have brought this up here in 2020, that there are people like Jeff Bezos who lives in massive mansions, and there are people like you and me who live in very tiny, small apartments and tiny, small houses. And so there's been this kind of anti-celebrity culture that's been going on, especially in the year 2020, as more and more of us are forced to live within our homes. I'm not going to go off on that anymore. I'm going to stop talking about it. I just at least want to bring it up so that way you actually think about it. Let's talk about some of the problems with industrialization. I've already mentioned a few of these here, but it's at least good to have them on the screen. That way you guys can see it as well. First off, there's more money and power into fewer hands. And I brought up this idea of new elites, the people like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, people who start their own businesses and make a whole lot of money. For the more modern day example, think Jeff Bezos. So people are very worried about these new elites because they have more money and more power. That's why Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and Tim Cook are constantly being dragged in front of Congress in order to testify about their companies. And if you don't know who they are, Jeff Bezos is with Amazon, Zuckerberg with Facebook, and Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. And so, because these individuals have so much money, they have a whole lot of power. And because they have that whole lot of power, they can abuse that power. Many people are very worried about that. Modernization is going to hurt farmers. People who were farming can no longer keep up. I mean, there's so many cases of people giving up the family farm and moving into the city in order to find work. These, once again, there's no OSHA regulations. There's no maximum amount of work hours, so people are working 12 to 16-hour days. I mean, imagine how tired you get at the end of an 8-hour school day. I mean, you're absolutely exhausted. You're hardly capable of doing anything after working for that long. But imagine doubling that. Imagine working 16 hours in a single day. I mean, see this, this little kid right here. Think about the way that you approach your last class of the day, especially when we were back in person. You're very tired. I noticed in the last class of the day, that's when I get students who fall asleep because they just cannot keep their eyes open because they've been working the entire day and studying and they're unable to focus. Well, when you're unable to focus in school, your head hits the desk and maybe I lift your desk up a little bit to wake you up. You don't die. You don't get your hand cut off. If this little kid starts to lose focus after 14 or 15 hours of work, well, there's a chance that his foot goes in the machine and now he's walking with a peg leg. So these are the issues that people have, and these are not like frivolous little issues where it's like, oh, people just got to work really hard. No, like these are very serious issues that people need to address. There's also very low pay for workers, and we'll talk about unions and strikes and women in just a second here. Let's talk about those unions and strikes. So, what is a union? A union is a group of workers. Usually, these workers are all in the same trade. That's not necessarily always true, and you'll look at all of these specific unions next year in AP US history. But generally speaking, unions have all the same workers. For example, there is the teachers union here in Clark County School District. Everyone who's in the union is a teacher or at least works in a school. Now, the whole point of the union is to say, look, we have all of the people. If we, the people, refuse to work, then the people who are above us, our bosses, are going to be unable to make any sort of money. So they need us. They need us, the workers. And if we go on strike, then we can get what we want. And when workers go on strike, that means they don't show up to work. And so one modern day example that just came to my head is the teachers union here in Clark County School District went on strike. I believe this was last year and said, we're not going to work until we get higher pay, until we get better working conditions, until we are actually treated like actual adults instead of being treated like children, and all of these other demands. And they got most of those demands because they were willing to go on strike. So this idea of unionizing and going on strike really begins with the Industrial Revolution because you couldn't unionize before. After all, if you're on a farm, you're by yourself. I mean, your closest neighbor is going to be a half mile away from you. So you can't really unionize if you're not close to one another. If you're in the city, you are close to one another, so you can actually start to form a union. Well, these unions and strikes have mixed success at best. You have the Haymarket bombing, which you'll learn about more next year in AP US history, but it turns violent very, very quickly. And it leads to unions being viewed as very negatively. People start to view unions as very radical, as very violent, as something that they shouldn't associate with, which makes it much more difficult for unions in the future to actually get what they want. We've already talked about the Homestead strike at Carnegie's steel mill, in which the workers rebelled and went on strike against the working conditions of the steel mill. So they demanded better working conditions, especially after one of the laborers had died, and they demanded higher pay as well. The government brought in the Pinkertons, which was this kind of more mercenary for hire group by this point, to actually put the strike down. And the Pullman strike was led by Eugene V. Debs, who was a very famous socialist in the United States, and President Cleveland, who was president of the United States at the time, uses the army to put down the strike as well. So we see that strikes are fairly unsuccessful during this time period, but the idea I want you to get from here is that the industrial revolution is the reason we now have unions who go on strike. And if you ever turn on the news, you'll actually see that happen often, especially during this time period here in 2020. Let's go ahead and talk about our separate spheres as well. We start to see some changes in the way that women are going to be observed, but we're also going to see continuities as well. So prior to the industrialization, women worked alongside men on farms. I mean, everyone in the family had to work in order to survive. So women are obviously going to work. But once people start to go into the factory, once people start to move into the city, then you get something that we call separate spheres. The men's sphere was over here in the factory. The women's sphere was over here in the home. They were supposed to stay in the home, as we see with this cartoon here. A woman's place is in her home. And that's where the woman is supposed to stay because the man is supposed to go to work. We see that that's not always true. About 20% of working class women are going to work in the factories. So we can identify that as a big change as this starts to normalize women in the workplace, which is going to be huge down the road. But we also still see a continuity. That means 80% of women, of working class women, are still expected to stay at home and take care of the children and cook the food and do all these domestic chores. And almost 100% of middle class women are certainly expected to do so. You would never see a middle class woman go be a doctor or a lawyer or do any sort of work of that nature. She would be expected to stay in her domestic sphere. So we see both change and continuity there. So we can use that in our writing moving forward. We also see these responses to these domestic spheres and the way that women are being treated. So one that I did not bring, one woman that I did not talk about previously was Olympe de Gouges. She's French and she's an author of the Declaration of Rights of Women and Female Citizen. So if you think back to our study of the French Revolution, we have the Dogomat, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, in which it stated that all men are created equal and that all men have rights. Olympe de Gouges, being French and read that, said, I think you're forgetting about 50% of your population. Women should also be included in there. We've already talked about the Seneca Falls Convention, in which Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes the Declaration of Sentiments. Remember, that's that big convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in which women started to demand equal treatment to men. This is a continuation of the work that was first started by Mary Wollstonecraft. And we went over her last semester at the very, very beginning of Unit 5, because this is an incredibly long unit. So it seems like it was forever ago, but it's still in the same unit. Eventually, all of this will lead to women gaining the right to vote in the United States, and then eventually in Britain, and then eventually throughout most of the world as well. Although not all of it, so it's important to keep that in mind. We also get these social reformers that are trying to deal with the issues that are brought up by both capitalism and industrialization. So what they see is that capitalism has created this massive economic divide. There are really, really rich people and there are really, really, really poor people. And the really, really, really rich people are unaware of how the poor people live. It's easy for us sitting here in 2020 to look back upon these new elites like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Henry Ford and say, how do you not understand what was going on in your factories? But at the same time, we in 2020 don't always understand the world around us. I mean, it's not often that we think about sweatshops in China and child laborers across the entire world. We just really don't think about that because we're involved with our own lives. I mean, think about it. We're living in 2020. We're going through a lot right now. We have to stay inside. Some of us have jobs. All of you guys have schoolwork you need to do. You don't really have time to sit around and think about the ills of society around the world. So there's going to be these reformers who try to make that evident to people. People like John Stuart Mill, Jacob Riis, Jane Addams are going to say to the rich people, hey, you're unaware of how the other half lives. You're unaware of what's going on in your own society, and we need to address that. John Stuart Mill will be the first one to do so, and he comes up with this idea of utilitarianism. He says that we should create a society that creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, he doesn't want to overthrow capitalism. He thinks capitalism is actually pretty good. I mean, it's created a whole lot of wealth. It's created all this technology as well. Now people have access to all of these new goods, but it's definitely created society that is not creating the most good for the greatest number of people. So he's going to champion reforms that allow for unions, that allow them to go on strike, that prevents child labor, that establishes minimum wage laws, that creates safe working place conditions. That way, everyone can participate in the wealth that's being produced by capitalism. Jane Addams is actually going to be one of these reformers who wants to help educate poor working class immigrants. So what she sees is that many immigrants come to the United States, especially in her hometown of Chicago, and they don't have the working skills in order to really bring themselves up. I mean, there's this idea in the United States that you kind of pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps. Like you're going to work really hard and make something of yourself. And sometimes that's a very true thing. But if you don't know how to speak English, if you don't know how to read and write, if you don't have the skills, then no, you're not going to be able to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So Jane Addams wanted to help these working class immigrants by founding Hull House, which is the name of her organization. So it's not just charity, it's not just giving money per se, but it actually is providing educational services to empower as opposed to enable people. She still believes in capitalism. She still thinks capitalism and the amount of wealth that it's produced and the technology that's created is a good thing. It just needs to be reformed. But that's in direct contrast to our next person, Robert Owen. He's not a capitalist. He sees capitalism as evil because it produces rich and poor. He starts to promote the ideas of socialism. And we'll be talking about socialism and communism with Karl Marx in just a second here. Now, Robert Owen's idea is not to necessarily reform the industrialized society, but to leave the industrialized society. So he wanted to move people out of the cities and he wanted to create his own town called New Harmony, in which men and women work side by side. There are no rich factory owners like Carnegie, there's no poor people. Everyone lives in communal enjoyment with one another and everyone owns the property together. It ends up failing after a couple years, as many of these utopias do. These utopias were, and there were many utopias created during this time period to address many of the social ills of the Industrial Revolution. Pretty much all of them failed. Let's go ahead and talk about the modern class system, and then we will get into the most radical response to industrialization, communism. So capitalism begins to rise, and we saw that with laissez-faire and Adam Smith and all of that. Capitalism rises at this time and produces new social classes, the old elites and the new elites. So remember, the old elites are people who are part of the aristocracy. Their families were very wealthy during the age of feudalism. They're still incredibly wealthy, and they're going to still be incredibly wealthy because they'll be able to invest their money and they'll be able to save their money, and they already have money and land, and so they're doing fine. These new elites start to come into play, people like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Henry Ford, all of those people. Then we get the middle class. We are going to call the middle class the bourgeoisie. These are your factory owners. These are your doctors, your lawyers, people who generally have a college education. If you're thinking back to the revolutions of 1848, these are the more moderate individuals. They have a bit of money, they have a bit of power. They're definitely college educated as well. They have now access to more money and more goods that cost less because of industrialization. They're the ones who own the factories. Keep that in mind because I'm going to use that phrase in just a second. We then have the working class. This is the proletariat. These are mainly your former farmers or sons of former farmers who had to move in the city. They're the ones who are working in the factories. If we're really going to break this down into more of a modern day example, the bourgeoisie or people like Jeff Bezos. The working class is like all of the Amazon employees. And at the bottom, you have the poor who are homeless. There's a massive homeless population because partially because of the Industrial Revolution. We're not going to talk about that as much. We're really going to focus on the bourgeoisie and the proletariat by looking at Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher, and he saw many, many issues with capitalism. All the things that we just went over, he said those are all the issues with capitalism. There's this massive economic divide. But what he saw is that the rich would get richer, the bourgeoisie, the factory owners would get more wealthy, the poor would get poorer, the proletariat, the factory workers could not make as much money. And so this greatly concerns him because he sees that this is almost unfair and actually destroying society in a certain way. So he wanted to propose a different type of or a different way of organizing society. Instead of having capitalism, he wanted to propose communism, in which the people control the means of production. So when I say the means of productions, I mean the factories. So underneath capitalism, one person, we'll make it simple, one person owns that factory. For example, Carnegie owns the steel factory. He owns the means of producing steel. And because Carnegie owns the means of producing steel, he's the one who makes a whole lot of money. And then he pays his workers like $1 a day, and they can barely make ends meet, and they live in these cramped conditions. They have to go, work in these dirty conditions where they could possibly be killed. And so Karl Marx says that the proletariat, the working class, needs to rise up and they need to seize the means of production in order to enrich themselves. What he's thinking about during this time period, maybe the context of his writing of the Communist Manifesto, is that he's looking at the revolutions of 1848. If you think back to the revolutions of 1848, we saw that the moderates did not give the radicals what they wanted. And that's what Karl Marx is thinking as well. The bourgeoisie is never just going to hand over the means of the production to the proletariat. They're never just going to hand it to them. So the proletariat must rise up and take it. The proletariat, the working class, has more people. And since they have more people, they can rise up and they can take over. He actually uses some of the things that we've studied in history, and we'll see this when we read part of the Communist Manifesto, is that he goes all the way back to the age of feudalism. He says, well, look, kings always were oppressing serfs. How is that any different from new elites like Carnegie oppressing the proletariat and the working class? And the king was never going to hand over land to the serfs. The serfs had to take it. And we've talked about that after the bubonic plague, how the serfs rose up and tried to fight against the king in order to get more land and more money and better working conditions and things of that nature. So Karl Marx is encouraging revolt. He's encouraging the proletariat to rise up, to unionize, to form together, to revolt against the bourgeoisie in order to establish communism and thus get rid of capitalism. If I understand that a lot of this is fairly confusing because it's all theoretical stuff, but hopefully it will make more sense once we get into class and we actually look at the Communist Manifesto itself. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to go ahead and wrap up our lecture here. Our next lecture in the Industrial Revolution will be our last one, and that will be on industrialization in non-Western countries.